So I think the tension today is that, and the kind of great irony is that if you were, in a sense, sincerely concerned about preserving the American system of a kind of liberal democracy and markets and trust in institutions, you would basically have to embrace some version of the Bernie Sanders agenda.
Hi everyone, what you're about to watch is an interview I conducted earlier this week with the left-wing US talk show host Michael Brooks. He is the host of The Michael Brooks Show and the author of a new book called Against the Web, A Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right. He was also a supporter of Bernie Sanders' most recent effort to become the Democratic presidential nominee. In the interview, I asked him about, among other things, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, now that he is, of course, the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee. I hope you enjoy the interview, and if you do, then please do subscribe to my channel because I plan to do a lot more interviews like this going forward. Michael, thanks a lot for agreeing to talk to me today. So I'll start with a straightforward question. Should people on the left in the US vote for Biden? And actually a second question as well. Will you be voting for Joe Biden?
Yes and no. So if you're in a competitive state, I would definitely recommend that you vote tactically for the Democratic nominee, and I'll explain that in a minute. I live in New York, so I have a luxury to cast a protest vote. I might do it, I might not. I have to say, I think the bigger question here is what is an actual strategy for the left moving forward after a very significant defeat and with a lot less power than we would like to have. I mean, there is opportunity now, but we need to be really serious about how limited the avenues are right now. And we can think of this sort of wave that started with Syriza. Syriza was not able to overcome the European community, let's say, the Troika. I think they were under enormous external pressure, obviously. Maybe they made their own mistakes. That's maybe a conversation for another day. Corbyn, incredible breakthrough in 2017. Bernie running in different ways, two very strong races, but we're not there. Now, there is a growth of various movements that are and organizations like the DSA in the United States, which can play a very positive role. I personally don't see any possible viable future for a left project without a significant resurgence in organized labor that's fit for the moment, fit for purpose. That's very complicated. In other ways, it's, it is as simple. And you do see some signals now with Amazon workers and others going on strike. They're under enormous pressure. We're in some ways facing a kind of unprecedented consolidation, really, of monopoly capital, and connected with the new platforms and technologies that we all have already totally started to dominate our lives, and it's only increasing, obviously, in the Corona age. The reason that I say you should vote, so the first thing is the lens needs to get much wider than who you are or aren't voting for. That is, in many respects, that's kind of the very question there, and people building a brand on one side or another of it, whether it be, well, I'm tactical and I'm strategic and I'm going to vote for the Democrat, or people who, are rushing to some new version of a kind of, 1% protest vote that amounts to nothing. In both frames, you're making the issue of this vote paramount, which it should not be and can't be if you want to build any sort of long-term left project. Now, that said, because I don't think there's any, I don't value protest voting, and because I do recognize that there is real power in the executive branch, the obvious question does start to become a lot of things that people don't want to talk about. And I understand they're deployed cynically by the Democratic establishment. They're also true. If we accept that labor is paramount who you put in an NLA, on the National Labor Relations Board, who those appointments are very important. Is Joe Biden absolutely dominated by, the 1%, by the corporate sector? Is he a right-wing Democrat? No doubt, no question. He also has labor unions who have endorsed him and are in his coalition. There's nothing parallel in the Republican Party. So this isn't like a bedtime story. I think when people come out and say, oh, we've made this progress and we can push Biden, forget it. Biden's never going to support single payer. Biden is never going to, shift U.S. foreign policy. He is never going to do those things. And it's a question of everything from his donor base to his own ideological project, which has been in the works for decades. I mean, not only is he a third way right wing Democrat, he's a leader in moving the party in that direction. And at the same time, we do have to look at things if we're talking specifically about voting, then you have to look at things tactically, and things like judicial appointments and labor relations boards become relevant. I understand why people resist talking about those things. I understand how they're cynically used, but I also understand that that's the reality. And the final quick point I'll make on this is that this is all in the context of right-wing populism is a scam. There is no, the tectonic plates have not shifted. At the end of the day, in spite of some, commentaries by Tucker that might have a much more accurate understanding of the issues facing, workers in the United States than people you hear on MSNBC. You might hear some occasional concern about wage stagnation or whatever else. But where does that go? It goes into either the, xenophobia and racism, which we object to on moral grounds. Obviously, we also object to on strategic grounds. There's no possibility of a countervailing force, for serious labor action that takes place in some type of fantasy, soft or hard ethnopolitics or idea of community that supersedes labor power. It's a fantasy. So we object to it because it's morally disgusting to demonize asylum seekers, as an example, and abuse their human rights as are being done. And it's also strategically a fool's errand. And at the same time, the actual policies that the administration has put in place are not, that move has not been made. They've relentlessly pushed against labor, what little power labor has left. The biggest national legislative package the Trump administration passed before the bailouts, which are an obscene consolidation of platform capitalism we were talking about earlier, was the 2017 tax cut. So they're out running around pushing to cut food stamps. They are in fact xenophobic, racist, sexist, everything else. And they're pushing against, and they're pushing for tax cuts. They're redistributing money to the financial sector. So that isn't real. So we're in a situation where, as the left, we have to see that, this is the choice: a dead, discredited neoliberal center right, where there might be a few ways of sort of holding back the sort of breach a little bit, holding the I don't know what the right imagery for this is, but holding some back a bit. And then a right-wing populist project that is not only not economically populist, it is populist for certain sectors of white identity politics, which we object to, obviously, and is has actually the capacity to build a governing mandate decades ahead.
You mentioned a discredited neoliberal center-right. Could you just expand on that, Michael? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that, Joe Biden fits into, and Macron and Trudeau are the younger versions of this. But this was the third way basically is a very specific political project that has a lot of different tendencies and influences, but we could say really simply in the United States, starting in the 1980s with something called the Democratic Leadership Council. These were mainly Southern Democrats and policy entrepreneurs and some politicians, including Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who basically wanted to move the Democratic Party to the right, both economically and socially. They wanted to sort of reappeal to what was already starting to be called, or to the Reagan Democrats. And they would do that by embracing things like the death penalty. And they would also appeal to the business sector by being willing to take on labor unions and support different aspects of deregulation. And this project spread. I mean, there was in the 1990s. I mean, the Third Way had global summits. They actually really had a sort of global vision for governing that encompassed heads of state from Italy to South Africa to Brazil to the Netherlands to obviously the UK. I mean, Tony Blair might even be rhetorically the most recognized for that Third Way label, and Anthony Giddens, who's of course the British academic, was very influential in this stuff. Now, there was contradictions inside it from the beginning. A guy like Stan Greenberg, the Democratic pollster who actually did the polling on the Reagan Democrats, and Clinton's first campaign in '92 was actually a bit more, it certainly was moving to the right, and definitely was overtly race baiting with things like the death penalty and the infamous, this disgusting Sister Souljah moment. But they also were calling for things like increasing the corporate tax rate and national health insurance. So there was always these contradictory tendencies in it. But this was a governing style that really fit the 1990s. I mean, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union collapsed. There was superficial, broad-based prosperity. I mean, there was more people participating in the stock market. There was, there was a rise in wages. There was various bubbles and tech and finance and so on. And they thought they found the right formula. And, Obama governed in that formula, and Biden is somebody who not only is in that formula, he helped move the Democratic Party in that direction. And I think in today's, in 2020, there's the fact that we might be, we're further to the left. We want, more worker power and so on. But it's also just a question of where we are. And if you look at, Macron is not popular in France. There isn't new markets. There aren't as many new bubbles, as new ways to kind of juice money into the system and get people to sort of buy into the market framework. That basically that formula is not fit for purpose in 2020 the way it could have been in the 1990s.
I want you to expand on that, Michael. Why do you think that the current moment does not suit a candidate like Joe Biden, whereas, as you said, in the past, politicians of that sort of ilk, of that sort of ideological framework, were successful, at least electorally?
Yeah, they were. They were successful electorally. Well, I mean, we're talking about the meltdowns on Wall Street. This has happened after the 2008 recession, but also actually the 2002 bubble was pretty significant as well. I mean, if I had to simplify it, I would say that I think the UK was probably further than the United States, because the United States already has such a meager safety net to begin with. But the idea that essentially you can deregulate, and maybe not deregulate as much as right-wing parties want to deregulate, but deregulate, allow monopoly, allow consolidation in financial sector, which poses strategic threats to the economy, which we've started to see, again, particularly in 2008, and then sort of take some of that excess and redistribute it, is not of the moment right now. I mean, partially because those meltdowns have already eliminated so much wealth to begin with, right? I mean, 2008 alone, what it did in terms of people's personal wealth and working in middle class by devaluing property values, as an example, is astounding. So even a lot of the things that the Clinton administration could have bragged about were wiped away, in that moment. And now we're also seeing a different arrangement in terms of receptivity from capital itself. I mean, if you look at this latest bailout, we're skyrocketing in unemployment in the United States. We're going to hit, conservatively, I would assume, 30%. It's a catastrophe. Millions of people are filing for unemployment every week. And the stock market is doing just fine. Now, yes, they could catch up on each other. I still think there's a Keynesian argument here that at a certain point, that many people being unemployed and unable to spend will start to spill over into the broader economy. But as you know, there was a great piece that went up in ProPublica yesterday that just said, look, this bailout is working for what it was designed for, which was to shore up the financial sector. So I think the other kind of dynamic you have right now is you don't have the sense in the 1990s and in the early aughts that on the one hand, because there wasn't, the left was completely discredited or had no real viable paths to power. And also there was a sense of endless prosperity that, there was maybe there was more receptivity, I think, to some aspects in the capital class of kind of this sort of like very light redistributive policies. And, that's what Biden's running on. And he's got some, donors behind him to do it. But I just don't see how you recreate that. It's a different moment than the 1990s. How are you going to recreate that level of prosperity for normal people from the stock market, new bubbles that can filter out as they did before? I mean, people are looking obviously at things like 5G, smart cities, but in their very inception and design, the types of jobs they will create will not be high earning jobs. There's also a completely different power balance in the world today. China might very well dominate 5G. That's sort of that's one of the kind of primary tensions. So, and then, where else is it? I mean, I guess there's always jobs. There's always capacity in the energy sector. Again, what kind of jobs do those create? What kind of environmental problems do they create? I don't see. I think in the 1990s, you still had enough residual sort of incumbent benefits in the professional, in the sort of upper middle class of people who had actually come up through the Keynesian system in the 60s and 70s. They had a lot of wealth built up. Maybe they had done well in the stock market under Reaganism. And then you had a couple of enormous bubbles to ride. And that, and again, nothing was done with it. Right. I mean, this is Joseph Stiglitz's point in the roaring 90s. There wasn't any kind of structural redistribution. Obviously, in retrospect, a lot of the deregulation was reckless in both the United States and the UK, and it led to things like 2008. But I don't see even that kind of superficial level of prosperity. I don't see it being recreated through following a similar set of policies as you did in the 90s. Things are more concentrated and there's less to go around, if that makes sense.
So if this isn't Joe Biden's moment, why wasn't it Bernie Sanders' moment? Why wasn't he able to secure the Democratic nomination?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But, one is that, and things have already changed so much in the last several weeks with Corona. But the Sanders campaign, to the extent that they had the capacity to overcome a lot of serious structural hurdles. So I think we need to be really real about that. And obviously we see in the UK, I mean, even more extreme in terms of the Labour Party high command itself directly undermining Corbyn's campaign. Bernie comes into the race with a lot of, a media that's unified against him, an electoral class in the Democratic Party that is hostile to him. And just the unrelenting opposition from, you know, every sector of wealth and power in this society, right? I mean, so there's real structural barriers that we need to be honest about. I think strategically, what the campaign, what was difficult for the campaign and what wasn't able to be pulled off, and I don't know where we are now, several weeks into Corona, was figuring out how to reconcile different tendencies in the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is not a left party. It's a very broad coalition of people, a lot of whom are, maybe if you ask them in a poll, some of them might support relatively social democratic policies, some of them absolutely may not. But the overwhelming interest in the Democratic Party, particularly when you went to older Democratic Party voters and definitely the voters in the suburbs that won the 2018 midterms, was get rid of Donald Trump. And attached to that, some notion of get back to normal. Now, what normal is, how normal can be recreated, very unlikely, right?
You're saying there's an element perhaps of nostalgia here, and that's perhaps maybe why Biden was.
I think there's definitely an element of nostalgia and a real desire for normalcy, and I think that what and it was a very hard thing to pull off, and I think, but somehow running a campaign on the message that these serious changes to things like healthcare are actually the only path to getting back to some type of semblance of normal, because we're not going to go back to an old version of normal. It's a very hard thing to pull off. So, for me, again, in the margins where they could have done things, I would have dropped the rhetoric about revolution and this and that. I think that there are some rhetorical moves they could have made that would have been helpful. I think that there was definitely a big miscalculation amongst a lot of people, thinking that the kind of Elizabeth Warren's run definitely hurt Bernie. And her role, I'm sorry, I know that this kind of bothers some people, but her role was very destructive and unhelpful if you care about this policy set, things like Medicare for all. But the thing was that Bernie, she was actually, people got too caught up in, and maybe in kind of media circles, there was people toying between Bernie and Warren, but in a broader electorate, there were actually, look, because of media and because of the branding of them as the two quote unquote progressive candidates, it wasn't just like he shouldn't have laid a glove on her. I actually think it was a big mistake. They needed to differentiate from her substantively much earlier on. But there was this whole other kind of argument with her that was really represented by a lot of online discourse, where they were sort of like trying to out-woke each other, and really just had nothing to do with the electoral battle. It was a Sanders-Biden race. And what's funny to me is that in some ways Biden's electoral coalition just looks like an older version of Bernie's. Biden did quite well working class voters and people of color and so on, and Bernie did very well with working class and people of color under 45. And instead of sort of this endless distraction with Warren, who, again, she was a threat. She needed to be neutralized early, and I wish people acted accordingly in a kind of proper campaign way. But the real argument and the real focus actually, in retrospect, should have been to go to the older voters that were swooped up for Biden and basically make the case that Bernie's more electable and safer. And it would have been very hard, and obviously, another thing that happened was this unprecedented consolidation of all the other candidates dropping out and endorsing Biden. And South Carolina always would have been a really hard push no matter what, and stipulate all those things. But I think if there was any tactical and strategic lessons to understand, to learn, those would be it.
Michael, after Bernie Sanders suspended his campaign, you responded to that on the Michael Brooks show with a couple of your colleagues, and I remember you making a point that there has to be an acknowledgement that people's personal ambition is okay, their desire to improve their livelihoods is okay. I just wondered, why did you think it was important to make that point at that time?
I think that there was a lot of, again, in our circles, it's not that Bernie Sanders was out on television. Again, actually, Bernie is a very underappreciated, effective politician. He is clear. He's relentless. He has a very, very simple and obvious vision that is appealing in a lot of ways to a lot of people. I think that in general, though, there's this broader tendency among some pockets of the left, and ironically, where we could learn from some of the third way people, not from the 80s and 90s. I mean, people identify as third way now are people who are, they might as well be walking around with like a CD Discman trying to wedge in their pocket or something, whatever. I mean, these are just the worst sort of loathsome corporate bagmen. But if we look back at the 80s and 90s, not that this is our ideological project at all, some of the things they were doing was trying to really, they were responding to different market conditions and different changes in public opinion. Now, I think we need to learn some of those lessons as well, not in terms of substantive shifts on policy, but in terms of like how we're appealing to voters generally. And I think in that case, I don't remember that conversation specifically, but I think Bernie Sanders, when he was mayor of Burlington, was a very great supporter of workers' cooperative ventures, which are very important and an interesting area. He was also a supporter of certain types of small businesses. And I just think we need to be more generally comfortable with, you can't always be trying to sort of program how you want people to be. And I think that there's a lot of discourses that I see that get away from, a lot of just where people are at, whether it be relating to their own personal ambition or, slogans that like abolish the family. Now, I understand, first of all, that obviously a lot of people, for a variety of reasons, I'm not interested in like families can be a big problem. So it's not about idealizing the family in some type of like Norman Rockwell painting. But at the same time, a lot of people actually find the family to be one of the only areas of privacy and an area of outside of market dominance in their lives. This is something we have to embrace and respect. And I think just more generally, I think actually when it comes to issues that are more on the so-called like social spectrum, there just needs to be a much greater focus on, look, when it comes to substantive, legal, and civil rights, we have very clear red lines. We support full legal, civil equity and safety and justice for all, period. And then beyond that, a lot more just frankly kind of live and let live. I think that sometimes people could get the impression from the left, just like sometimes from the right, that it's a big social engineering project. And, it's like, you can't vote for the health care without like giving up, baseball. And, I just in general would frankly drop all of that. I think to me, I find a lot of it, frankly, not that intellectually compelling. And I certainly think if you're trying to run a campaign, you have to signify these things. And another debate that I noticed people were going into, kind of real, I think just ridiculous extremes about was this idea of should Bernie wear a flag pin? And some people were, kind of saying that, basically if Bernie wore, I think overestimating the importance of that visual of him wearing a flag pin. But then I'm also seeing other people saying like, the pin is a symbol of American empire. And it's like, look, come on. The guy's running for president of the fucking United States. Like this isn't a student union meeting. If you showed me numbers that could help me get 1% of the vote, it's a completely obvious thing to do. And the importance of it may well have been overstated, but the idea of actually reacting against it, and objecting to a presidential candidate doing it is ludicrous, and doubly ludicrous because this is somebody who, within the contours of what is politically acceptable, was actually willing to take real risks on areas that actually mattered, like calling for freeing Lula, like voting against sanctions against Iran, like putting some areas like disarmament back on the table. I mean, these are the serious things. And so I think that sometimes there's a lot of times there is a real big confusion between the symbolic and the substantive. And if we were to think more clearly, I think actually it's very lucky because, there aren't that many issues. There might be sometimes issues where we have to say as a matter of principle or whatever, that even though we're an extreme minority, we have to kind of hold a line on. But in a lot of these cases, it's, if people were writing columns saying Bernie needed to say that the capital of Israel needed to be in Jerusalem, and I have a poll number that shows, then it becomes a very hard question. And again, a question that I think on the merits, you just have to, and one of the ways Bernie distinguished himself was obviously on recognizing the basic humanity of Palestinians. His positions weren't radical on that issue at all, but in an American context, suggesting that Palestinians are, human agents who deserve the bare minimum of legal and humanitarian respect is a radical position. So if somebody wrote that column, then we would have to push back, and that would be an important conversation. But even to, if somebody came along during the campaign and said, hey, Bernie, you want to throw this flag pin on your jacket, that helped 5 people feel more comfortable to vote for him, great.
Let me ask you this very bluntly. Was it wrong for Bernie Sanders not to adopt universal basic income as part of his policy platform?
Was it wrong to? I don't think that would have done much either way, to be honest with you. I mean, I know that a lot of the, I know I'm like a villain for the Yang people. And in some ways, like I'm always questioning honestly, like we all evolve as we do these things. We all have to think about how we could present things better, how we can make our arguments differently, and also where we just make, mistakes. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I'm a big, I hate all the kind of maximalist cancel culture shit, because I think that it's also, we're all human beings, and whether it's a minor mistake or a serious mistake, we also, we have to rebuild, we have to keep evolving, we have to keep doing what we do. So I think if I had to do it again, when Yang first came out, I would have focused a lot more time on what he was saying and why that was appealing to people as best as I could perceive it. Now, and I think he was speaking to very serious human needs and to some very, very credible issues. Now, at the same time, substantively, I was right. I didn't, he wasn't somebody who, and I think it's just a reflection of very different politics. And it was disturbing to me at the end. And this is where I noticed with people who supported him, who really, the difference between people, you could really tell the difference in Yang supporters between those who were upset by how he talked about his position with single payer, where basically he does not support Medicare for all, but started talking about supporting the spirit of Medicare for all and all this, look, don't support Medicare for all, but don't be dishonest in your language. That should be a principle for everybody. And I think the people that were fans of his that had a problem with his slipperiness with that were people that I could definitely have a dialogue with and accept their criticisms about some of the ways I had covered Yang. The other people who just said, it is single payer because he wants good things for people. I'm sorry. That's embarrassing cult-like thinking. This stuff actually means something. It's an actual policy. And by the end, I mean, that was something he was being dishonest about. I think So, yeah, to me, a UBI without a robust social safety net is not going to meet the challenges of the moment by any stretch of the imagination. I'm also somebody who's interested in rebalancing power in society. I don't think that that's an interest for Andrew Yang. Now I know, and again, I can already hear a million people shrieking and freaking out. But again, it isn't. That isn't to say that I don't think he's got, that he doesn't want people to do well or whatever. But I want labor to be back. I don't see any viable path for, frankly, even protecting a modest social democracy without a powerful labor presence. So I think if you sort of say the ship has sailed on breaking up monopolies, and you don't even really talk about labor much at all, and you don't have you're not clear on things for Medicare for all, and your answer is some cash transfer, it's not going to do it. It's not going to do it. So, look, on a policy level, a universal job guarantee is significantly more important and an actual threat to monopoly corporate interests. Electorally, I mean, to be blunt, Yang didn't get any votes. So I don't know what, again, to me, it's just like sort of like the Warren principle, like energy that should have been focused on Bernie. If those were your politics, if you care about this stuff, if I think there's plenty of people who supported Yang who, and certainly people supported Warren who, they aren't on board for completing the New Deal. They're not, that isn't where their politics are at, and that's fine. But I think for people who could have been in the Bernie camp, and if they were really taking the stakes of the election seriously, again, I do. That's why I do not like the role that Warren or Yang or Gabbard played, frankly, because I did think it was a really serious election. UBI generally, I'm not opposed to it, as long as it's built, if it's integrated into a really serious policy platform with Medicare for all, federal jobs guarantee, and things like that.
Why did you prefer the federal jobs guarantee? Can you just go into that a little bit?
Well, the federal jobs guarantee would be, along with Medicare for all, would really give labor unions a boost in this country. I mean, if you know that you have a federal job guarantee to fall back on, that if Amazon punishes you for organizing, you have a job, you have a way to provide for your family, you have health insurance that isn't attached to your employer. The amount of freedom that people will feel in these corporations to start to organize, whether it be at Walmart or Target or Amazon or whatever, is going to substantially increase. I also think that with a federal jobs guarantee, and it's interesting because there's a book that came out in the 1990s by a guy named Jeremy Rifkin called The End of Work, that very much went into the automation, the elimination of jobs through automation, which was another focus of Yang's. And he, among other policy proposals, was very interested in bringing back, New Deal programs I'm sorry, the name of it is completely escaping me. But the point is that there was incredible federal jobs programs in the New Deal that not only, paid people for physical infrastructure, but actually paid people for music, for culture, for art. I mean, these things still are positive influences on American society today. So I think if we enlarge it beyond just job, quote unquote, and I agree, sure, there's plenty of bullshit jobs or whatever, but I do think there is meaning and purpose from activity. And I think when you have a federal jobs guarantee, in addition to the frontline stuff, which is a major boost for unions, which is the most important thing on a political level, it also is a way of saying, because it's federal, you can say, we're building in these other targets. I mean, there's social value to different jobs. There's all sorts of other, there's plenty of things that we should be paying people to do in a society. Art, mentoring. I mean, what if somebody's like, of their own time, completely rebuilding or, helping organize a local sports network for kids, like that takes a lot. And obviously it's not a question of, there's some tension there between the value of people feeling the innate drive to volunteer and do things for sure. But at the same time, we do want to put a monetary support behind people's social contributions. So what a federal jobs guarantee can do in terms of labor and in terms of rebuilding the physical social infrastructure of the United States is just completely unparalleled. And again, it's about redistributing power too, Yeah.
Let me ask you a few more questions about Joe Biden. You've talked a lot about Joe Biden's weaknesses in your eyes. What do you think his best strengths are, particularly in light of the fact he's facing Trump?
I think his best strengths are that a lot of people do want this return to quote unquote normal. I think, and again, I think this is something that honestly I see a lot of people with my politics not fully appreciating. I think there's also a lot of people on the right that don't fully appreciate it. I think that a lot of Americans would love to, they certainly want more support from the government in terms of healthcare, and they want better wages and things like this, without a doubt. But I think they would also love to, get back to some sense of their lives are not dominated by politics. There isn't a president who is melodramatic and unstable, and some kind of generic sense that the people running the machinery know what they're doing. Now, if you look at Joe Biden sort of cognitively and physically, this is a problem. In 2016, Joe Biden, again, just as an objective performer, he would have kicked Trump's ass. It would have been no problem. So there are, again, the Joe Biden thing is a disaster in many, many ways. But I do think that you can't underestimate that desire for normal. And I also think, the calculus has changed in the last couple of weeks. Trump, I would have said 2-3 months ago, without a serious challenge from somebody like Sanders, who might have been able to undercut him in certain key geographic areas, as well as have his own dynamic support base. Like Bernie would be a better general election candidate than primary candidate. You would need someone like that to take on Trump. And it was still going to be really hard, and Trump was unfortunately very likely to get reelected. Several weeks into this, he's incredibly vulnerable. And a lot of people, again, I listen to all of these conversations, and some of it's totally right. And I wish people more, did vote like this and think about this. But you gotta have at least the normie people that you talk on the phone, and you look at the polls. And I think that there's plenty of people who they don't, it's sort of, if you look at that, Trump has a very serious base of support. Then there's a very serious section of people that fucking hate Trump. And I think there's a chunk of people that I don't even necessarily define them as swing voters. They probably don't particularly like Trump, but it's one thing to, it's one thing to say like, he's kind of ridiculous, he's an asshole, but things seem to be going fairly well with the economy. Now, this is true, and I think, again, there's a dual thing. I think fairly well with the economy amongst people who are doing fairly well. Obviously, we know that, structurally the economy is a disaster for working people. But again, on the other hand, what's going to motivate somebody to vote? And so, these are really important questions. But I think, my basic point here is that if 2 months ago you wish Trump would shut the fuck up and be more normal, but you feel like things are basically going okay, I don't know how you're going to vote. But if you think that he won't shut the fuck up and be more normal, and you know that he just allowed a pandemic to get set off, I think you're very likely going to vote against him.
Michael, Joe Biden has also committed to choosing a female running mate. What do you think about this? Do you think it is a welcome development because the US has never had a female vice president? Do you think it plays into the Republicans' hands because it allows them to paint Democrats as being obsessed with identity politics. Perhaps you think something else. What do you think?
I mean, look, I think obviously from my perspective, the policy and the politics supersedes anything else. So, obviously, I mean, this isn't going to happen, but, Bernie should be in the mix, not that he'd want it. And in fact, probably electorally, that would be the most, that there's a case to be made that would be the smartest choice. At the same time, I think obviously the woman's vote is very important. I think one of the biggest dangers Trump is actually looking at is that his numbers amongst white working class women are going down. There's a structural critique of identitarian politics. And I think that, this is another area where so many arguments can be, I could talk to my grandmother and she could say, well, I want Trump to lose. And, I want whoever is going to be the most effective vice president for the job and to beat Trump, no matter who they are or what their background is. And then on the other hand, she'll say, and yeah, of course, it'd be good to have a woman vice president. It's like, yeah, like I think that represents the opinion of both, that all of these things are held together for most people. So of course, I think, look, there's absolutely an element of the election of turning out the base 100% and also undermining again, just like if Trump was able to snag a couple of percentage points from African-American voters, which they're clearly trying to do, I don't think it's going to work. I was more worried about it a couple of months ago. Now I'm less worried about it. And if, on the other hand, if the Democrats take a couple of percentage points of white working class women. So, the question really becomes, again, who is the smartest choice to do that? I think I could see a very compelling case for Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, and actually particularly too if you had any kind of remote seriousness of suggesting that there was going to be some progressive dimension to the politics, to the policy set. But he made the commitment. He'll do it. I think the question now here is more, harm minimization and making sure that he doesn't pick somebody who would, be a disaster.
Also, at the moment in the US, there's a lot of media spotlight on this sexual assault allegation against Joe Biden from his former staff assistant in the early 1990s when he was a senator called Tara Reid. How major an impact do you think this will have on the election?
I don't know. I mean, it's obviously having an impact, and it's a very serious story, and they're going to investigate it, or and it's going to be talked about. Electorally, I don't think much, to be honest, not much.
And earlier, you talked about cognitive decline. Obviously, Joe Biden, 77 years old, he's made a lot of gaffes, for want of a better word, on the campaign trail. Is this a serious issue?
Again, a serious issue. It's sort of like, all of these things in and of themselves are serious issues. I think this one might be more threatening in the sense that if you have a moment at a debate where he completely looks out of sorts, and you have a kind of a TV reel moment, that is contemporary. Again, this is something that's happening right now. Yes, it could be threatening. On the other hand, I hate to sound so cynical, but no, not much. I mean, I think the big picture, I think as a personality, Donald Trump is the more important personality, both positive and negative. And the questions that are going to determine the race are the structural questions about the economy and so on. And I think that just as, frankly, a couple of months ago, the way things looked, it was probably the way things looked a couple of months ago, actually, Donald Trump is in some ways uniquely unpopular, because if he was another president with that sort of relative performance with the stock market and jobs, that would be a president who probably would almost certainly be pretty comfortably, reelected. And Trump, so I don't think that Trump is in any way exceptionally popular. That's delusional. He's actually probably a bit less popular than he would be otherwise. But on the other hand, he's got a fanatical support structure that other people wouldn't have. So in some respects, it goes both ways. But I just think that the election is going to come down to, if there is a vote in November, which is another question, frankly. But is it, if we are heading into November and we are at over 30% unemployment, and I say this as somebody who, by the way, I think the Democratic Party in every respect is such an absolute disaster that I was terrified when, several weeks ago, Trump was getting good numbers on how to handle this. And honestly, there was a moment where, even though it should have, and there's a million things that should have cost them the reelection, but there was a moment where it was already a crisis and it was their fault. But if they had kicked into gear and, things had broken the right way, maybe, and maybe also if he had, actually done a few of the kind of populist things he was hinting at doing, which of course he's not done, maybe they could have consolidated. And if anybody could snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory, it's the Democratic Party. I would, betting on the Democrats losing is always a very safe bet. But that being said, you go into the fall.
Why do you say that, Michael? Why do you say that?
They're not very, look, if we look at the last several decades, the last couple of decades, the Democratic Party performs well, either if it's in the congressional midterms, like 2006 or 2018, when the Republican Party is in full power, executive and legislative, and they have messed up so catastrophically that the Democrats can basically run pretty much just an anti-incumbent campaign with different variations in different places, right? In 2006, you had Iraq, Katrina, and like a pedophilia scandal, essentially, with the Republicans. In 2018, you have Trump as an out-of-control asshole and also trying to take away your health care. And then the other way that Democrats win is, frankly, having extraordinarily charismatic individual politicians on the top of the ticket. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, both of whom oversee big declines in their own party's grassroots base. Under Obama, state legislatures are being lost all over the place. And there's a big decline in the structural power of the party itself. So, again, with the Democrats, and I'm talking about this not even as somebody who obviously is from the left, and I think it's obscene that we're not talking about things like Medicare for all, and you can't separate the effectiveness of South Korea's response from the fact that they have national health insurance, as an example. But the fact that the Democratic Party does not even have the capacity to clearly and unequivocally punish Trump for this is kind of awe-inspiring. The performance of Pelosi and Schumer is stunning. So that's what I mean, is that, look, I would never count out the Democrats figuring out a way to lose. But that being said, you go into the fall, you're at massive depression level, beyond depression level unemployment. How many people have died? And this guy is only talking to his base. He's only whipping up a small group, an aggressive, strong, but a minority. They are a minority. And things are a disaster. Yeah, I think he's in big trouble. Very big trouble.
Last question, Michael. Let me ask you about America more broadly. According to Gallup polling data, trust in the presidency and in Congress as political institutions is lower than it was in the 1970s. What has to be done in America, Michael, to reverse that trend?
I mean, you need to get so many things need to be done, but I mean, there does need to be some. If I was thinking of this again as just even somebody who had more buy-in to things as they are than I do. I mean, basically, you just need to read the editorial page of the Financial Times. You would need to say people need to have some stake in this again. I mean, this is something that, again, even in the 1990s, I mean, the 1990s were very toxic because there was a joint Republican and Democratic war on labor, on the poor, a massively racialized attack, and racist attack on welfare, which impacted poor people across the board. There was an expansion of the prison industrial complex. So that legacy carries through. And actually, in fact, as we've only deepened those policies, basically just more and more sets of people have experienced those deindustrialized conditions, right? In terms of the economic aspect. But at the same time, again, you had these bubbles, you had people who today are saying to themselves that they did all of the quote unquote right things and their wages are going down and their kids will make less than they do. And from a strategic point of view, if you're trying to keep viability in the system, you need to close that gap. So, if you were, and I think there's certain parts of the Democratic Party that sort of understand that, but they're so, first of all, bought by corporate interests themselves, frankly, and they've tried to substitute that systemic project with various kind of like narrowly tailored identitarian politics. But it has to be some policies to get a broad-based buy-in back into it. Now, again, I think that's difficult because I don't think there isn't this is what I was trying, and I'm sorry, don't think I articulated it well, but what I was trying to say earlier was that when you have a tech bubble to create, when you have new financial instruments that are going to end up blowing up in people's faces, but in the moment can create, through the 90s and then particularly in the Bush era, obviously, people can superficially feel like they're doing incredibly well because they own a house, or people think they're building a fortune in real estate or something. There are ways of basically creating these bubbles and juicing money into the system and having people feel, in some cases, figure out how to succeed, like they're winning in the system without any kind of core redistributive policies. So I think the tension today is that, and the kind of great irony is that if you were, in a sense, sincerely concerned about preserving the American system of a kind of liberal democracy and markets and trust in institutions, you would basically have to embrace some version of the Bernie Sanders agenda. Maybe not in all of its shapes and forms and, different rhetorical emphasis. And again, this is why Bernie's different, because Bernie is willing to go up against the donor class, which is the more kind of, crude part of it. But he also, even though his agenda wasn't radical, this guy really cares about democracy, he cares about workers' rights. He wants a different power balance in the society. But somebody could come along and, and kind of say, hey, we just need to, and frankly, that was what Warren was trying to do. But again, Warren messaged it in such a narrow way, and she isn't the kind of vehicle for it because of her limited sort of skill set as a campaigner and so on. But anyways, I think that you would have to get back some type of broad-based buy-in, and that would mean recreating some avenues for security, stability, and prosperity. But in order to do that now, you do need to go in a more overtly social democratic direction. And I don't see any appetite for that inside the capital class in the United States at all.
Michael, thanks ever so much for your time.
Hey, appreciate it, man. Thank you.